No More Shall We Part. A story written by Simon Shaw, read by Paul Bentinck, recorded by Leon Radzinski-Gorman, illustrated by Alexa Garside. Earl Grey lived day to day in constant anxiety. Earl Grey was a tea bag. No different to any other tea bag, except this particular tea bag was anxious. He didn't want to leave his brothers and sisters, you see. He didn't want to be used, squeezed dry, and flung into the garbage. Thankfully for him, coffee was the drink of choice, and he spent the better part of each day undisturbed, watching coffee drinkers come and go. Earl Grey even had time to fall in love. Ceylon was her name, and he thought she was lovely, the most beautiful tea bag in the whole wide shop. And, even lovelier, the kind who leaves her beauty alone. They had never actually met. How could they? They were tea bags. But there was a connection. He felt it. And he felt so did she. Then one fateful day disaster struck. A tea drinker chose a cup of Earl Grey. Earl Grey was flung into a cheap paper cup. Ceylon cried out for her beloved. And then the tea drinker changed his mind. He became a coffee drinker instead. "I might need the extra caffeine," he explained. "It's going to be a long day." Poor Ceylon, who nearly fainted away, agreed with him, and Earl Grey could hardly contain his bergamot-infused tears of relief. But he was a cautious tea bag. He knew he had to be careful not to soil himself. So he stopped crying, propped himself up to his best and smiled, awaiting the moment he'd rejoin his brothers and sisters. But it didn't happen. The cup was put down, he in it, and that's where he remained for the rest of that long day in constant anxiety. Earl Grey didn't lose hope. He kept his spirits up by dreaming of him and Ceylon together in some unknown corner of the shop, where tea drinkers wouldn't be able to separate them. It was a most pleasant dream, one he'd had often, and it lasted until the lights went out and the shop was closed, and Earl Grey was forgotten. He couldn't help it. He cried. He bawled and wailed, to be more precise, because he knew it was definitely now all over. It was only a matter of time before the shop would reopen, the lights would flicker on, and he'd be discovered at the bottom of the cup, soiled. His worst nightmare would come true, and he'd be flung into the festering garbage. Viscid gloom descended upon him. He was doomed. And then the lights flickered on. In his devastation, the night must have passed him by entirely. At least, that's what he thought. He had been remembered. His cup was picked up, and before he knew what was happening, he'd rejoined his brothers and sisters. By all appearances, his brothers and sisters. As the shop had reclosed, the lights had gone out. Eventually, however, his sight grew accustomed to the moonlit darkness around him, and he saw that he wasn't with his brothers and sisters at all. He was with Ceylon's brothers and sisters, and they were all smiling at him and giggling because next to him was Ceylon. It had happened. They were together, finally together. But there was a problem, a somewhat delicate problem. Earl Grey had soiled himself terribly. In fact, he'd been crying and bawling and wailing so much he was now soiling those around him. Solon didn't mind at all. But the others, they were frantic, fearful for their little lives, and pretty soon they too were crying and soiling those around them. And so it was that the entire box of tea bags was ruined. It was over. They knew it. Only a matter of time now before the shop would reopen, the lights would flicker on, and they'd be found, flung into the stinking garbage and discarded. It was everyone's worst nightmare. And yet throughout it all, Earl Grey and Solon continued to smile dopily at each other, because they knew that no matter what happened, they would now always be together, inseparable. Literally inseparable. Their soiled bags acting as the cohesive that binds them together. The next morning, the shop did indeed reopen. The lights did indeed flicker on. And lo and behold, the box of soiled tea bags was discovered. Their fate was sealed. The box of tea bags was flung into the garbage bin, brusquely carted away, and incommodiously transported with other bags of decomposing rubbish, terrified of their final destination. What coffee and tea drinkers refer to as hell, what tea bags refer to as landfill. And there they'd spend the rest of eternity being picked at and ripped apart by squawking, flying white devils. At least, that's what they'd been conditioned to believe after generations of indoctrination. But for Earl Grey and Solon, it wasn't so bad. It wasn't even landfill. It was just an enormous compost heap. So, as compost, they were then bagged and tagged and shipped far, far away from any tea drinkers, to a newly planted forest. And here they spent the rest of their lives growing old, as soil of the earth from which a tree would eventually grow. No more shall we part.
Two lovers stuck in a sweet embrace, hoping you never move or change, in the lost love and dust of a summer home.